The Immortal John Hancock here, and today I'm going to be talking about my favorite console, near and dear to my heart, the Sega Genesis, and why I love it so much. And you know, there's many people out there, you're going to have your favorite console and why. And in today's video, I just thought I'd share with you some reasons why it is so close to my heart and why I've really just enjoyed collecting it, playing it, talking about it. I've done many Sega Genesis videos on my channel. I've done rankings of several different individual companies. I intend to get back to that at a later time when I have more time. But today is just a celebration of, you know, to me, everything that I loved about 16-bit gaming. For people that don't know, the Sega Genesis was my first console that I earned with my own money a long time ago. I actually was looking in a magazine. I saw Neo Geo. I showed it to my dad. He says, "That's great, son." And he pointed to a lawnmower and says, "That's how you're going to earn it." Well, I saved up enough money to get a Sega Genesis, as a Neo Geo was too expensive. But you know, earning something with your own money at the time, you know, that really made me appreciate and play every game and celebrate how awesome the Sega Genesis was. You know, for me, I really loved the controllers at the time. That 3-button controller was just perfect. You know, a lot of arcade games had 3 buttons. The Sega Genesis was a perfect console to offer, you know, at the time, some impressive graphics. And you know, that 3-button controller eventually evolved into the 6-button controller, which I did love, which then turned, you know, evolved later into the Sega Saturn controller, which is one of my favorite controllers of the time. And so, but really that 3-button controller for me, I really appreciated it and thought it was a good controller of the time. And later, you know, now you can, all different ways of gaming on the Sega Genesis. 8-bit Do makes a great controller. There's arcade sticks. There's even ways of using other controllers on the Sega Genesis. But, you know, going back to the Sega Genesis, the aesthetics, you know, that sleek, black-looking console. And it was just awesome looking. You know, it was a huge contrast to the NES, which kind of looked like a toy. You know, it really, Sega Genesis was going bold and really trying to provide something very different than what Nintendo was at the time. They went against Nintendo eventually. You know, Genesis does what Nintendo, they really went after what Nintendo was trying to do. Also that marketing and blast processing, you know, that was just a market spiel. But, you know, when I think of Sega Genesis, if I was to think of one word to, you know, really solidify what Sega Genesis means to me, it's speed. You know, they had speed in their sports. You know, when Sonic the Hedgehog came out, it was a game changer. It really showed, hey, this is what this console can do. And, you know, eventually Super Nintendo came out, and, you know, those early Super Nintendo games didn't necessarily, especially in sports games, didn't show the speed that Sega Genesis offered. Eventually, as time changed with programming, you know, it got a little bit more fair. But really going back to the Sega Genesis, just it offered very fast gaming. And you know, being a fan of the original 2600, which had lots of fast games on it speed-wise, I really appreciated that about the Sega Genesis. And, you know, going back to the variety of games, there was any type of game that you would ever want on the Sega Genesis library. It was a little light on RPGs, but there was enough there to kind of, you know, for me, as that's not something that I necessarily game on, especially now. But it had a ton of arcade ports, brawlers, fighting, puzzle, you name it, tons of platformers. Some would say too many, but the variety of games was there, and as well, that third-party support. It was just amazing. There were several companies that did several games on the platform, and it was heavily supported, as it was neck and neck with Super Nintendo for a long time on who was number one, especially in North America. It went back and forth, really close there. And so, you know, that third-party support, you know, and if you're interested on what came out on the Sega Genesis, I do several ranking videos going over lots of obscure companies. Eventually I'm going to get to Sega, but I've done a lot of overview of different companies and what they provided for the Sega Genesis. And I also cover some games that were only Mega Drive exclusives, but you may want to check that out. Next up is that packaging. That packaging was awesome. You know, that clamshell, and having, you know, depending on the company, a nice, you know, tree-killing thick book. I'm looking at EA for those. Some had extra goodies, maps, but, you know, they offered a great way of storing a game in a clamshell, you know, and it was different than a VHS case, but it could fit nicely on a shelf. And I loved that the different companies had different, you know, types of artwork and colors, and really just loved that about the Sega Genesis. It wasn't so, I would say, sterile as some other game companies, you know, had kind of the same looking boxes and packaging for everything. Sega Genesis had distinct different packaging for different companies, and I really enjoyed that. As you know, the Sega Genesis has concluded its production officially years back. You know, in the late 90s, it really was just there wasn't anything else that Sega was offering. And that's where the aftermarket support really began. And in the last decade, there's been more and more aftermarket support for the Sega Genesis console, as there's many homebrewers making aftermarket games. I think a Second Dimension, which, you know, they helped me work on my own game, Block 'em Sock 'em. And, you know, that's it's just a great way of providing aftermarket games to people. Is just fantastic, and there's a lot of amazing games that have been provided and are still available. I think of Mega Cat Studios is another one, Second Dimension, Pico Interactive. There's a lot of companies that are offering aftermarket Sega Genesis games, and you may want to check them out because there is a multitude of fantastic stuff out there, and it's coming out all the time. There's also some smaller producers of games that come out, and I've covered many of these homebrew games on my channel, including Kai Magazine is one, for example. And so, yes, aftermarket support is important, and I think that it's great to see many projects still being made, and you may want to continue to check Kickstarter as well, as some of these games typically go that route before they're released. Next up is durability. And, you know, I've had great luck with my Sega Genesis units. You know, anytime you have a console that doesn't have a lot of moving parts, you know, cartridge based, you're typically going to have more reliability. There's no lenses that go out, even though there was a Sega CD add-on. I'm just talking about the Sega Genesis in general. You know, there's things that are going to break and stuff, but typically Sega Genesis console is fairly easy to repair, and there's a lot of aftermarket parts. Stone Age Gamer is a place where I go to check out to get some parts for my Sega Genesis if needed. And durability is a big factor, you know. For consoles that break quite a bit, you know, I'm looking like the Xbox 360, that impacted my love for that. For me, the Sega Genesis, you know, for the duration of my teenage years into college, I didn't have any major issues whatsoever with my Sega Genesis setup, and that really made me a loyal customer to the brand, as I have so many positive memories with several different games. And so last and definitely not least, you know, there's a lot of people that don't have the availability to play Sega Genesis on original hardware now. I love that the game legacy lives on in emulation and aftermarket. You can play it online. There's several different consoles that offer Sega Genesis collections, everything from Steam to modern consoles. And, you know, for some purists out there, you may want to play on original hardware, but there's even aftermarket hardware such as the Analog SG, you know, which is a fantastic way of playing Sega Genesis games. There's, you know, EverDrive carts to play the games if you want to go that route. And however you play Sega Genesis, and if it's finding enjoyment for you, if you're having fun, and that's great, you know, enjoy it and just celebrate a fantastic 16-bit console that offered a multitude of different games. Definitely in the comments below, what are your favorite memories of Sega Genesis? And I want to thank everybody for coming to my channel. If you like what you see, consider hitting that like and subscribe button and clicking the bell as I'm uploading videos every week. You folks are wonderful and beautiful. Let's keep it positive. This is Immortal John Hancock, and you have a good day.